Mesha, was 12 years old when he began his reign. He ruled 55 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil from Adonai's perspective, following the disgusting practices of the nations from whom Adonai had expelled ahead of the people of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had smashed. He erected altars for the Baalim, made sacred poles and worshipped all the army of heaven and served them. He erected altars in the house of Adonai concerning which Adonai had said, "My name will be in Jerusalem forever." He erected altars for all the armies of heaven in the two courtyards of the house of Adonai. He made his children pass through the fire as a sacrifice. In the Ben-Hanim valley, he practiced soothsaying, divination, and sorcery. He appointed mediums, persons who used spirit guides. He did much that was evil from Adonai's perspective, thus provoking him to anger. He set the carved image of the idol he made in the house of God, concerning which God had told David and Shlomo his son, "In this house in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. Also, I will not remove the feet of Israel from the land I assigned your ancestors. Only if they will take heed to obey every order I have given them, that is, all the Torah, laws, and rulings that came through Moshe." Manasseh caused Yehuda and the people of Jerusalem to go astray, so that they did even worse things than the nations whom Adonai destroyed ahead of the people of Israel. Adonai spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they paid no attention. Therefore Adonai brought against them the commanders of the king of Ashur's army. They took Manasseh captive with hooks, bound him in chains, and carried him off to Baal. Then, when he was in distress, he began to appease the anger of Adonai, abjectly humbling himself before God of his ancestors. He prayed to him, and God was moved by his plea, paid attention to his entreaty, and brought him back to Jerusalem, to his kingly office. Then Manasseh understood that Adonai really is God. After this, he built an outer wall for the city of David on the west side of Gishon, in the valley extending as far as the entrance of the fish gate. It encompassed Ophel, and he built it very high. He stationed army commanders in all the fortified cities of Judah. He removed the foreign gods and the idols from the house of Adonai and all the altars he had built in the hill of the house of Adonai in Jerusalem and throughout the city. He repaired the altar of Adonai and offered on it sacrifices of peace offerings and for thanksgiving, and he ordered Yehuda to serve Adonai, the God of Israel. However, the people continued sacrificing on the high places, although only to Adonai, their God. Other activities of Manasseh, his prayer to his God, and the words of the seers who spoke to him in the name of Adonai, the God of Israel, are recorded in the annals of the kings of Israel. Also his prayer and how God was moved by his plea, all his sin and disloyalty, and the locations where he built high places and set up the sacred poles and carved images before he humbled himself are written in the history of the seers. Then Manasseh slept with his ancestors and was buried in his own house, and Amon took his place as king. Amon was 22-years old when he began his reign. He ruled for 2 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil from Adonai's perspective, as had Manasseh his father. Amon sacrificed to all the carved images and Manasseh his father had made and served them. He did not humble himself before Adonai as Manasseh his father had done. Rather, this Amon kept adding to his guilt. His servants conspired against him and put the king to death in his own palace. But the people of the land put to death all those who had been part of the conspiracy against King Amon. Then the people of the land made Yoshiyahu his son king in his place. Yoshiyahu was 8 years old when he began his reign, and he ruled for 31 years in Jerusalem. He did what was right from Adonai's perspective, living entirely in the manner of David his ancestor, and turning away neither to the right nor to the left. For in the 8th year of his reign, when he was still young, he began seeking the God of David his father. And in In the 12th year, he began cleansing Yehuda, Jerusalem, from the high places, the sacred poles, and the carved images and cast metal images. In his presence, they broke down the altars of Baalim. He chopped down the pillars for sun worship mounted above them. He smashed the sacred poles and the carved cast images, metal images, grinding them to dust, which he threw on the graves of those whom had sacrificed them. He burned the bones of the priests on the altars, and thus cleansing Yehuda and Jerusalem. He did likewise in the cities of Manasseh, Ephraim, Shimon, and even as far as Naphtali, in their surrounding ruins. He broke down the altars, beat the sacred poles and carved images to powder, and chopped down the pillars for sun worship throughout all the land of Israel. Then he returned to Jerusalem. In the 18th year of his reign, after he had cleansed the land and the house, he sent Shaphan, the son of Etziyahu, Messiah, the governor of the city of Yoch, the son of Yechaz, the recorder, to repair the house of Adonai his God. They went to Hilkiah, Kohen Haggadol, and handed over to him the money that had been brought into the house of God, which the Leviim who guarded the door had collected from Manasseh, Ephraim, and the rest of Israel, and all Yehuda and Benjamin. Then they returned to Jerusalem. They gave it to the supervisors of the work. They gave it to the supervisors of the work being done in the house of Adonai, and those doing the work in the house of Adonai used it to repair and restore the house. That is, they gave it to the carpenters, the construction workers, to purchase work stone, timbers, and cross beams and roof beams for the houses which the kings of Yehuda had destroyed. The men did the work faithfully. Their supervisors were Yachat and Obadiah, Leviim from the descendants of Merari, also Zechariah and Meshullam, the descendants of Katim, to give direction, and other Leviim, all whom could accompany singing with musical instruments. They supervised those carrying the loads and everyone doing any kind of work. And there were also Leviim who were secretaries, officials, and gatekeepers. While bringing out the money that had been brought into the house of Adonai, Hilkiah Kohen found the scroll of the Torah of Adonai given to Moshe. Hilkiah said to Shaphan, the secretary, "I have found the scroll of the Torah in the house of Adonai." Hilkiah gave the scroll to Shaphan. Shaphan, the secretary, brought the scroll to the king. Turning it to the king, he gave him this report: "Your servants are doing everything you ordered them to do. They have poured out the money found in the house of Adonai and handed it over to the supervisors and workers." Then Shaphan, the secretary, told the king, "Hilkiah, the Kohen Haggadol, gave me a scroll." Shaphan read it aloud before the king. After the king had heard what was written in the Torah, he tore his clothes. Then the king issued this order to Hilkiah: "Echakim, the son of Shaphan, of Dan, the son of Micah, Shaphan, the secretary of Esiah, the king's servant, go and consult Adonai for me, and for the people left in Israel and Yehuda in regard to what is written in the scroll which has been found. For Adonai must be furious at us, since our ancestors did not observe the word of Adonai and do everything written in this scroll." So Hezekiah and those the king had ordered went to Huldah the prophet, the wife of Shallum, the son of Takat, the son of Hesrat, keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in the second quarter of Jerusalem and spoke with her about this. She told them, "Adonai, the God of Israel, says to tell the man who sent you to me that Adonai says this: I am going to bring calamity on this place and on its inhabitants. All the curses written in the scrolls they read to the king of Yehuda, because they have abandoned me and offered to other gods in order to provoke me with everything they do. Therefore my anger is poured out on this place and will not be quenched. But you are to tell the king of Yehuda, who sent you to consult Adonai, that Adonai, the God of Israel, also says this: in regards to the words you have heard, because your heart was tender and you humbled yourself before God. When you hear his words against this place and its inhabitants, you humbled yourself before me, tore your clothes, and cried before me. I have also heard you, says Adonai. Here, I will gather you to your ancestors. You will go to your grave in peace, and your eyes will not see all the calamity I'm going to bring on this place and its inhabitants." So they brought back word to the king. Then the king summoned and assembled all the leaders of Yehuda and Jerusalem, the king went out to the house of Adonai with all the men of Yehuda, those living in Jerusalem, the Kohanim, the Leviim, and all the people, both great and small. And he read in their hearing everything written in the scroll of the covenant that had been found in the house of Adonai. The king stood in his place and made a covenant, the presence of Adonai, to live following Adonai, observing his mitzvot, instructions, and laws wholeheartedly and with all his being, so as to perform the words of the covenant written in this scroll. Then, after he had all the people in Jerusalem, Benjamin, stand in affirming of it, the inhabitants of Jerusalem act in accordance with the covenant of God and God of their ancestors. Yehoshiahu removed all the abominable idols and all the territories belonging to the people of Israel, and he made everyone in Israel serve Adonai their God throughout his lifetime. They did not stop following Adonai, the God of their ancestors. Yeshayahu kept Pesach to Adonai in Jerusalem. They slaughtered the Pesach lamb the 14th day of the first month. He assigned the Kohanim to their posts and encouraged them to perform the service in the house of Adonai. To the Leviim, who were teaching all Israel, were holy for Adonai, he said, "Put the holy ark in the house which Shlomo, the son of David, king of Israel, built. After this, you will not have to carry it again. Now serve Adonai, the God of his people, the God Adonai, your God, and his people Israel. Organize yourself by clans, duty divisions, according to your arrangement written down by David, king of Israel, and Shlomo, his son. Stand in the holy place according to the divisions of the clans of your kinsmen, the ordinary people, with part of the clan of Leviim, serving with each clan of Israel. Then slaughter the Pesach lamb. Consecrate yourselves. Prepare what your kinsmen need, and act according to the word of Adonai given through Moshe." Yeshayahu gave the ordinary people to all who were present 30,000 lambs and kids from the flock, all of them the Pesach offering, and 3,000 bulls. They were from the king's personal property. Also his leading men voluntarily gave to the people of the Kohanim, the Leviim, Helikiyahu, Zechariah, Yehu, and Yechiel, the rulers of the house of God, gave the Kohanim 2,600 lambs and kids, and 300 oxen for the Pesach offerings. Konaiah, his brothers, Shemaiah, and Netaniel, and Hashabiah, Yael, and Yozabad, the head Leviim. Give the Leviim 5,000 lambs and kids, and 500 oxen for Pesach offerings. So the service was prepared, the Kohanim stood at their posts, and the Leviim worked in their divisions, in keeping with the king's orders. They slaughtered the Pesach lamb, the Kohanim splashed the blood which they received from the Leviim skinned and butchered them. They removed the portions to be burned in order to give them the division to the clans of the ordinary people to present to Adonai as written in the scroll of Moshe. They did the same with the oxen. They roasted the Pesach lamb on fire according to the rule, which they boiled the holy offerings in pot kettles and carried them quickly to the ordinary people. Afterwards, they prepared food for themselves and for the Kohanim, because the Kohanim, the descendants of Aaron, were busy till nightfall, offering the fat and the portions to be burned up. This is why the Leviim prepared both for themselves and for the Kohanim, the descendants of Aaron. The singers, the sons of Asaph, were at their post as ordered by David. Asaph, Heman, and Yuttan, the king's seer, the gatekeepers, were at every gate, and they did not need to leave their post because their brothers, the Leviim, prepared food for them. Thus all the service of Adonai was to prepare the same day for observing Pesach, offering burnt offerings on the altar of Adonai in accordance with the order of the king Yehoshiahu. The people of Israel who were present observed the Pesach at that time in the festival of Matzah for 7 days. No Pesach like that had ever been kept in Israel since the days of Shmuel the prophet, and none of the kings of Israel observed Pesach such as Yeshayahu observed with the Kohanim, Leviim, all Yehuda, those of Israel who were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. This Pesach was observed in the 18th year of Yoshiyahu. After all this, and after Yoshiyahu had restored the house, Necho, king of Egypt, went to attack Kirchmish by the Euphrates River. King Yoshiyahu went out to oppose him, but Necho sent envoys to him with this message: "Do I have a conflict with you, king of Yehuda? No, I'm not coming today to attack you, but to attack the dynasty with whom you are at war. God has ordered to speed me along, so don't meddle with God, who is with me, that he won't destroy you." Nevertheless, Yoshiyahu was determined to go after him. He disguised himself in order to fight against him and wouldn't listen to what Necho, said, which was from the mouth of God. Then, when he was to fight in the Megiddo valley, their archers shot King Yeshayahu. The king said to his servants, "Take me away, because I'm badly wounded." So his servants took him out of the chariot, transferred him to the second chariot, and brought him to Jerusalem, but he died. And he was buried in the tombs of his ancestors. All Yehuda and Jerusalem mourned Yeshayahu. Yirmiyahu composed a lament for Yeshayahu, and all the men and women singers had sung to Yeshayahu in their laments till this day. They made singing them a law in Israel, and they are recorded in the laments. Other activities of Yeshayahu and all his good deeds in keeping with what was written in the Torah of Adonai, also his accomplishments from beginning to end, are recorded in the annals of the kings of Israel and Yehuda. Then the people of the land took Yochaz, the son of Yeshayahu, and made him king in his father's place in Jerusalem. Yechayah was 23 years old when he began his reign, and he ruled for 3 months in Jerusalem. But the king of Egypt disposed him in Jerusalem and imposed a penalty in the land for 3 1/3 tons of silver and 60 pounds of gold. Then the king of Egypt made Eliakim, his brother, king over Yehuda and Jerusalem, changing his name to Yochakim. Necho took Yochaz, his brother, and carried him off to Egypt. Joachim was 25 years old when he began his reign. He ruled for 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil from the perspective of Adonai, his God. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, attacked him and bound him in chains to carry him off to Babel. Nebuchadnezzar also carried the articles of the house of Adonai away to Babel and put them in the temple of Babel. Other activities of Joachim, including all the abominations he did publicly and those discovered later, are recorded in the annals of the kings of Israel and Yehuda. Then Joachim, his son, took his place as king. Joachim was 8 years old when he began his reign. He ruled in Jerusalem 3 months and 10 days. He did what was evil from Adonai's perspective. In the spring, King Nebuchadnezzar sent and had him brought to Babel, together with the valuable articles of the house of Adonai, and made Zedekiah, his brother, king over Yehuda and Jerusalem. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began his reign. He ruled for 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil from the perspective of Adonai, his God. He did not humble himself before Yirmiyahu, the prophet, speaking on behalf of Adonai. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear loyalty to him by God. Instead, he became stiff-necked and hard-hardened, refused to turn to Adonai, the God of Israel. In addition, the chief Kohanim and the people grew increasingly unfaithful, following the abominable practices of the other nations, and they polluted the house of Adonai, which he had consecrated in Jerusalem. Time after time, and frequently Adonai, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them through his messengers because he had compassion on his people in the place where he lived. But they ridiculed God's messengers, treating his words with contempt and scoffing at his prophets, until the anger of Adonai rose up against his people to the extent where there was no longer any remedy. Therefore he brought upon them the king of Casdim, who put their young men to the sword in the house of their sanctuary. They had no compassion on their young men or young women, old men or gray-haired. God handed them all over to him. All the articles of the house of God, great and small, and supplies in the house of Adonai, and the supplies of the king and his leading men, all these he brought to Babel. They burned down the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, put to flames all its palaces, and destroyed everything of its worth. Those who had escaped the sword were carried off to Babel, and they became slaves to him and his sons into the reign of the kingdom of Persia. Thus was fulfilled the word of Adonai, spoken by Yirmiyahu, until the land had been paid her Shabbats. For as long as it lay desolate, it kept Shabbat, until the 70 years had passed. Now in the first year of Koresh, king of Persia, so that the word of Adonai spoken to Yirmiyahu might be fulfilled, Adonai activated the spirit of Koresh, king of Persia, to proclaim throughout his entire kingdom and put in writing as well. Here is what Koresh, king of Persia, says: Adonai, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of earth. He has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, in Yehuda. Whoever is among you of all his people, may Adonai, his God, be with him. May he go up